On the 14th of April, 1865, the Civil War was over. The Union had survived. Slavery was dying. And Abraham Lincoln finally had a reason to rest. 5 days later, he was dead. But that isn't the strange part. The strange part is this. Abraham Lincoln had spent most of his adult life convinced he might not survive long enough to matter. Not because of assassins. Not because of the war. Because of something that lived inside him. Something he called the hypo. A darkness so complete that, at 31 years old, his closest friend hid every knife and razor in the house. And yet, this same man guided a nation through the bloodiest war in its history. Signed the document that ended legal slavery on American soil. Delivered words that are still carved in marble, still read by school children, still quoted by presidents. The question history keeps skipping past is not how did he succeed. The question is, how did a man who could barely survive himself become the one person capable of holding a country together when everything was falling apart? What does this reveal about being human? That the darkness and the greatness were not opposites. They were the same thing wearing different faces. He was born on the 12th of February 1809 in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. One room, dirt floor, a fireplace that wasn't enough against the winters. His father, Thomas, was a farmer who moved the family repeatedly Kentucky to Indiana, to Illinois, always chasing land, always finding that what he'd hoped for was harder than it looked. Thomas Lincoln was not a cruel man, but he was not a warm one either. He believed in work and silence and the practical business of staying alive. He did not believe in books. He did not particularly believe in ambition. When Abraham read, Thomas sometimes took the book away. There was always more useful work to be done. Abraham read anyway. Walked miles to borrow books. Read by firelight until his eyes hurt. Read because even as a child, without the vocabulary for it, he understood that the world inside books was larger than the world outside the cabin, and he needed that largeness the way some people need air. His mother, Nancy, was different. Quiet, thoughtful. Someone who told stories and seemed to carry her own interior life with a kind of dignity that the hardness of frontier living hadn't entirely erased. Abraham absorbed her. In 1818, when Abraham was 9 years old, Nancy Lincoln died. She died of milk sickness, a poisoning caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten a toxic plant. It was a disease of poverty and frontier isolation. People who lived near doctors, in towns with markets and supply chains, didn't die of milk sickness. Nancy Lincoln died in the cabin where she had lived. There was no funeral in any formal sense. Thomas Lincoln built the coffin himself from green lumber. Abraham helped. He was 9 years old, helping his father build his mother's coffin. There are moments in a childhood that don't leave. Not because the child holds on to them, but because they install themselves into the architecture of how that child understands the world. How safe it is. How permanent love is. How much can vanish without warning. Nancy Lincoln's death was that moment for Abraham. Thomas Lincoln returned to Kentucky and came back with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. Sarah was warm and practical and immediately recognized something in Abraham that Thomas had never quite seen. She gave him books. She gave him permission. She told him, later in life, that she always knew he would be someone. But she was not Nancy. And the cabin was still the cabin. And the dirt floor was still the dirt floor. And somewhere inside the boy who read by firelight, something had gone quiet and cold in a way that warm words couldn't entirely reach. What does this reveal about being human? That the losses we absorb before we have language for them don't disappear. They go underground. They become the lens through which we see everything that comes after every abandonment, every silence, every moment when the world reminds us that nothing is permanent. He taught himself almost everything. Formal education, in total, amounted to less than a year. Scattered months here and there when the farm work allowed it, when a school existed within walking distance, when Thomas could spare him. It wasn't enough. And so he made it enough. He read Aesop's fables and the King James Bible so many times he could recite passages from memory. He read Pilgrim's Progress and Shakespeare. He read law books borrowed from anyone who would lend them, studying by firelight after the day's work was finished. He was physically extraordinary, 6 feet 4 inches tall, enormously strong, capable of splitting more fence rails in a day than men who'd been farming twice as long. He won wrestling matches. He could hold an axe at arm's length by the handle and not shake. But what drove him was not the body. It was the mind. And beneath the mind, the need. He needed to matter. Not in the way that ambition usually presents itself, not the hunger for status or wealth or recognition in the shallow sense. It was something deeper and more urgent. He had watched his mother die in a one-room cabin on a dirt floor, and some part of him had decided, without quite deciding it consciously, that he would not die that way. Not in obscurity. Not without having changed something. He moved to New Salem, Illinois in 1831. Worked as a store clerk, a postmaster, a surveyor. Read law. Made people laugh. He was already developing the gift for storytelling that would define him, a way of making people feel at ease, that masked how ill at ease he himself often felt. But none of it, not the progress, not the growing reputation, touched the thing underneath. The hypo came and went on its own schedule. Sometimes weeks of darkness. Sometimes a heaviness that sat behind everything, that made the jokes harder to find, that made the room feel airless even when the windows were open. He lived with it. He worked around it. He developed, gradually, an approach to it that was neither denial nor surrender. He acknowledged it, named it, and then looked for something larger than himself to attach to. He was learning, slowly and painfully, that meaning was the only medicine that worked. What does this reveal about being human? That the hunger for meaning is not separate from pain, it often grows from it. The people who need to understand why they're here are often the people who have had the strongest reasons to doubt that being here is worthwhile. January 1841. He was 31 years old. He had broken off his engagement to Mary Todd not because he didn't care for her, but because he was terrified of what he would do to her. He did not trust himself to be well. He did not trust himself to be present. He knew what lived inside him, and he was not sure it was fair to bring someone else into that house. The breakup sent him into the worst episode of depression he had ever experienced. Joshua Speed hid the knives and razors. Lincoln wrote to his law partner John Stuart, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth." He couldn't work. He could barely eat. He stayed in his room. He was, by his own account, and those of people around him, genuinely frightened of himself. This is the part of Lincoln's story that gets quietly edited out of the monument version. The version with the stovepipe hat, and the solemn face, and the Gettysburg Address already written. But it happened. It was real. And what happened next matters enormously. He didn't transcend the darkness. He didn't find a cure. He found a reason. He wrote in letters, in private notes, about a concept that would become the organizing principle of his psychology for the rest of his life. He called it a sense of duty to a task, not yet completed. He told Speed that the only thing keeping him tethered was the belief that he had not yet done whatever it was he was supposed to do. He didn't know what it was. He couldn't name it yet. But he believed it existed. And that belief was the narrowest possible bridge across the worst possible darkness. He crossed it. He resumed work. He reconciled with Mary Todd. They married in 1842. But the fear never left. It just changed shape. It became, what if I run out of time before I find the thing I'm supposed to do? What if the darkness wins before the purpose arrives? Some people spend their entire lives trying to escape the darkness. Lincoln spent his life learning how to work beside it. What does this reveal about being human? That the most powerful argument against despair is not happiness. It is purpose. Not the certainty of purpose, just the possibility. The sense that the story isn't finished yet. That there is something unwritten that only you can write. He lost. And then he lost again. And then again. The list is almost unreasonable in its length. Failed in business 1833. The store collapsed under debt. Lost his first run for the Illinois legislature. 1,832. Won a seat, then lost his bid for Illinois Speaker. 1,838. Defeated for U.S. Senate. 1,843. Defeated again. 1,855. Defeated for the vice presidential nomination. 1,856. Defeated for U.S. Senate. Again. 1,858. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, the moment that made him nationally known, ended with him losing the race. 7 times. 7 attempts at something, and 7 times the world said, "Not you. Not yet. Not enough." Most people, after the 3rd or 4th defeat, begin to rewrite their ambitions downward. They find a smaller dream, one that carries less risk of this particular pain. Lincoln didn't. And this is the part that requires psychological explanation, because it isn't simply stubbornness. Stubborn people lose repeatedly and become bitter. Lincoln lost repeatedly and became somehow clearer. Each defeat stripped away something. The performance of confidence, the expectation of reward, the idea that the world owed him recognition. What it left behind was something quieter and more durable. I am doing this because it matters. Not because it will work. That distinction between doing something because you expect to win and doing something because it must be done is the difference between ambition and vocation. Lincoln had arrived, through failure, at vocation. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively reopened the question of whether slavery could expand into new territories. Lincoln, who had held his opposition carefully in check for years, the pragmatism of a man who knew how to pick his battles, found something ignite in him. He stepped back onto the public stage. The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1,858 made him a national figure, a man who could hold an argument with the precision of a lawyer and the plainness of someone who had never forgotten where he came from. He lost the Senate race, and 18 months later, the Republican Party fractured. Desperate, unable to agree on anyone with too many enemies, chose him as their presidential candidate. Partly because he was brilliant, partly because he was the only man everyone could live with. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. Not despite the losses. In a very real sense, because of them. A man who had failed that many times and kept going had developed something that the men who had never failed didn't have. The absolute certainty that his worth was not determined by the outcome. He would need that certainty. What was coming would test it beyond anything the losing had prepared him for. What does this reveal about being human? That repeated failure, survived with integrity, doesn't just build resilience. It builds a specific kind of freedom, the freedom of a person who has already lost what they were afraid to lose, and discovered they're still standing. The Civil War killed approximately 620,000 soldiers. That number is so large it flattens into abstraction. So consider it this way. More Americans died in the Civil War than in World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. Lincoln sat with every one of those deaths. He read the casualty lists. He visited the hospitals in Washington that had been converted into wards, where men lay in rows with missing limbs and infected wounds, many of them boys who had lied about their age to enlist. He shook their hands. He talked to them. His secretaries begged him to stop. They said it was destroying him. He said he needed it. He didn't visit the hospitals because he was strong enough to bear it. He visited because he understood that a man who sends others into the dark has no right to stand in the light. He worked 18-hour days. He slept poorly. He had recurring nightmares, most famously, a recurring dream of a ship moving at great speed toward a dark and undefined shore. He told jokes. Constantly. At cabinet meetings, at moments of genuine crisis, in letters, in conversation. People sometimes misread this as lightness, as inappropriate levity. It was neither. It was a man who had learned, over 30 years of living with darkness, that laughter was one of the few tools that could briefly lift the weight enough to keep working. He was not light. He was disciplined. He suffered 2 devastating personal losses during the war. His son Willie died in the White House in 1862, typhoid fever, 11 years old. Mary Todd, already fragile, broke in ways she never fully recovered from. Lincoln grieved privately, in his office, alone, in the way of a man who has learned not to let grief show until the work is done. He kept working. What does this reveal about being human? That the capacity to hold grief and purpose simultaneously without resolving either into the other may be the rarest and most necessary form of human strength. Not the strength that doesn't feel, the strength that feels everything and acts anyway. He had made a promise to himself in that boarding house in 1841. He hadn't articulated it clearly then, but it had been forming for years through the failures, through the debates, through the war, and by 1862, it had hardened into something he could no longer avoid. The Emancipation Proclamation was not inevitable. His cabinet was split. His generals warned him it would destabilize the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, states still in the Union but still holding enslaved people. Lose them, and the war was lost. Several advisors told him directly, "This will cost you the presidency. This may cost you the war." He understood the math. He had been doing political math his entire career, the careful calculation of what was possible, what was survivable, what the country could absorb without fracturing further. He signed it anyway. The 1st of January, 1863. His hand was shaking not from doubt, he told those watching, but from hours of handshaking at a New Year's reception. He didn't want a shaky signature on a document this important. He steadied his hand. He signed. And in that moment, you see the full arc of what Lincoln had become. The boy who grew up on a dirt floor, who had watched his mother die with no one powerful enough to save her, who had spent 30 years carrying a darkness he hadn't chosen. That boy had grown into a man willing to risk everything he had built, everything he had fought for through 7 defeats and 4 years of war, on the belief that some things matter more than survival. He told those in the room, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, not for the military victories, not for holding the Union together. For this, some people spend their entire lives trying to escape the darkness." Lincoln spent his life learning how to work beside it. And when the moment came that required someone who had already made peace with loss, who could act rightly without needing to know the outcome, he was the only one in the room. He had been prepared, without knowing it, his entire life. What does this reveal about being human? That obsession, when stripped of ego, when it is no longer about what you will gain but about what cannot be left undone, becomes something indistinguishable from conscience. And conscience, at its fullest, will sign the document even when the hand is shaking. He was re-elected in November 1864. The war was nearly over. The end was visible for the first time in 4 years. His second inaugural address, delivered the 4th of March 1865, contains some of the most extraordinary language in American political history. Not triumphant language. Not the language of a man savoring victory. The language of a man asking what all of this had meant. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Bind up the nation's wounds. A man who had spent his life learning to live with his own wounds, now asking a nation to learn the same. Lee surrendered to Grant on the 9th of April 1865. The war was over. Lincoln had 5 days. On April 14, he attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, Our American Cousin. He went reluctantly. He was tired. He had been tired for 4 years. But public appearances were expected, and Lincoln, who had spent decades doing difficult things while exhausted, went. At 10:13 inches the evening, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and fired. Lincoln died the following morning, the 15th of April, 1865. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood at the bedside and said, in the quiet after Lincoln's breathing stopped, "Now he belongs to the ages." He never saw Reconstruction. He never saw whether the country would hold. He never saw whether the thing he had broken himself to preserve would prove worth the breaking. He never got to rest. What does this reveal about being human? That the people who give the most are rarely the ones who get to see what their giving built. The architect seldom lives to see the building finished. And perhaps that is part of the cost. The work demands everything, and then it demands the one thing left. We have made Abraham Lincoln into marble. Literally, the memorial in Washington, the seated figure with the heavy brow and the grave expression, the words of the Gettysburg Address carved into the wall. Marble doesn't bleed. Marble doesn't hide in its room for weeks, unable to move. Marble doesn't need its friends to hide the knives. The marble Lincoln is easier to live with than the real one. The real one is more uncomfortable. The real one demands something from us. Because the real Lincoln story is not, great man achieves great things. The real Lincoln story is, a man who was in genuine darkness for most of his life chose over and over and over again to keep going. Not because the darkness lifted. It didn't, not permanently. Not because he found a cure. He didn't. Not because the pain became manageable. Some days it wasn't. But because he found something the darkness couldn't argue with. Meaning. A task unfinished. A country that needed him. A wound in the national story that matched the wound in his own, a wound about who belongs, who is fully human, who gets to exist with dignity, and a belief that he was, somehow, the right person to try to close it. There is a version of the Lincoln story that says, he was great despite his suffering. That is the wrong version. The right version is harder and stranger and more honest. He was capable of that particular greatness because of what his suffering had taught him. It had taught him to endure without certainty. It had taught him that darkness is not the end of the story, only one of its chapters. It had taught him empathy for people in pain, because he had never had the luxury of being a stranger to it. It had taught him that the difference between surviving and not surviving is sometimes nothing more than the belief that the story isn't finished yet. He sat in hospitals with dying boys and held their hands because he understood, in his body, what it felt like to be in a room where the darkness was winning. He told jokes at cabinet meetings because he understood that laughter is not the absence of grief, it is the proof that grief has not had the last word. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation with shaking hands because he understood, more than perhaps any president before or since, the weight of a document that asks, who is allowed to be fully human? He knew what it was to feel less than fully human. He had felt it on the inside for 50 years. Abraham Lincoln did not conquer his darkness. He made a different choice, one that is quieter and stranger and more demanding than conquest. He decided the darkness was part of him, Not an enemy to defeat. Not a wound to hide. Not a weakness to outrun. A companion. One he had not chosen, but one he had decided to carry for as long as the work required it. And that is the thing about Lincoln that the marble cannot hold. The marble shows a man who was strong. The truth shows something harder to find. A man who was not strong, who was often barely standing, and who chose, in that condition, to be responsible for something larger than himself. He was not the hero who didn't feel the weight. He was the one who felt it fully and carried it anyway. And maybe that is the only kind of courage that matters. Not the kind that doesn't know fear. The kind that knows it completely and steps forward anyway. Because the work isn't finished yet.